Welcome to Short Stories. I'm your host, Martin. Today we will hear a story based on another of Mozart's operas, The Marriage of Figaro. This opera premiered in 1786 in Vienna, Austria, and was an immediate success. Mozart himself conducted the first two performances. The Marriage of Figaro, which was written in Italian, is actually a sequel to a French play called The Barber of Seville, which was also made into an opera. Both are comedies, with much of the humor coming from the physicality of the actors and the silly situations that they get themselves into. It's basically a sitcom, but fancier. Anyway, I will follow Emperor Joseph II's advice and try to shorten this story as much as possible. I have cut out some characters and side stories for the sake of brevity and clarity, but I tried my best to retain the key elements. I hope you enjoy it. This story has been modified from its original version. It has been formatted to fit this screen. Vocabulary: amorous, amorous. He looked at her with amorous eyes. Coot, coot. The old coot lost his cane. Doggone, doggone. That doggone cat has broken my flower pot again. Ill-bred, ill-bred. The Simpson family has 3 poorly educated and ill-bred children. Nuptial, nuptial. According to the nuptial law, you need at least 1 witness present at your wedding. Reminisce, reminisce. The old married couple liked to reminisce about the day that they first met. Sarcastic, sarcastic. John has a sarcastic orange cat. Stingy, stingy. Ebenezer Scrooge was infamous for being stingy. Count Almaviva was a wealthy man who lived in a mansion not far from Seville, Spain. He was getting to that age in a man's life where he reminisces about the vigor of his youth. That and growing dissatisfaction with his wife, who was only a few years younger than him, caused his eyes to wander. Unsurprisingly, those eyes wandered over to the youthful beauty of his wife's waiting maid, Susanna. Susanna had been employed by the Count for several years, and in that time she had fallen in love with the Count's chief steward, Figaro. The two were engaged to be married, which annoyed the Count and worried Susanna, who was becoming increasingly aware of the Count's amorous attention. Figaro, on the other hand, was more worried about the dimensions of their bridal chamber. 5, shouted Figaro as he measured the floor space with his ruler. 10, 20, that should be enough room for our bed, he said with much satisfaction. Susanna, who was brushing her hair in front of a nearby mirror, said, "How can you think of that now, when our boss is plotting to stop our marriage?" Figaro stood up from his crouched position and replied, "Ha! I'm not worried about that old coot. I've worked for him for so long, I know exactly how to neutralize him." Their conversation was interrupted when the service bell rang. "It's the Countess," cried Susanna. "She needs me." She left the room, leaving Figaro to continue his measuring. Not long after Susanna left, 2 unwelcome visitors entered the soon-to-be bridal chamber. "Marcellina! Bartolo! What are you 2 doing here?" exclaimed Figaro. "I'm here for what I am owed," said Marcellina coldly. Figaro stood before the pair, holding the ruler in his hands. "What are you talking about?" he said. Bartolo, Marcelina's personal lawyer, stepped forward and began his explanation. What my client means to say is that you had previously agreed to receive a sum of money from her as a collateralized loan, with yourself serving as the collateral. And since you have not repaid said loan, she has come to collect on the debt. Figaro glared at Bartolo and said, "Can you explain that in English?" Marcelina chimed in. "Actually, shouldn't you say in Spanish, since this story takes place in Spain?" Before Figaro could answer, Bartolo added his 2 cents and said, "I thought this story was written in Italian. Or was it French?" Figaro waved the ruler around in the air and blurted, "Whatever language you wish to speak, as long as it's not legalese." Marcelina stepped forward and said, "You owe me money, and if you don't pay, I will take you as my bondman instead." Figaro was silent for a few seconds before he replied, "Oh, well, since you put it that way." At that moment, Susanna re-entered the room and was shocked to see the stingy Marcelina accompanied by her unscrupulous lawyer. "The Count wishes us to prepare breakfast," she said to her fiancé, pretending to ignore Marcelina. "Well," Marcelina began, "I suppose you two must be going." Then, gesturing toward the door, Marcelina said in a sarcastically polite tone, "After you, gracious lady." Susanna bowed and replied, "I would not be so bold as to leave before you, worthy ma'am." Marcelina bowed lower and said, "No, you go first, I insist." Susanna was not one to be outdone. She bowed even lower, and in an even more sarcastic voice, she said, "A lady of honor should go first." Marcelina bowed even lower and said, "Brides first." Susanna, who was now bent at almost at 90 degrees, said, "Seniors before brides." Marcelina stood up, her face red. She huffed at Susanna and glared at Figaro before she stormed out of the room, followed by Bartolo. After breakfast, the Countess retired to her room, accompanied by Susanna, who proceeded to brush her mistress's hair. "Oh, love," lamented the Countess, "grant me some relief from my sorrows." Susanna asked what was troubling her. The Countess explained that her husband seemed less affectionate lately. "I bet he's thinking about another woman," sighed the Countess. Susanna tried to reassure her mistress. "He's probably thinking of buying a sports car. That's what most men his age do." Figaro now knocked and entered the room. "I've got it!" he exclaimed. "Got what?" asked Susanna. "I've got the solution to our accounting problem," he said. Figaro then explained to Susanna and the Countess his plan to thwart the Count's plot to stop their marriage. It was a ridiculously convoluted plan that involved forging letters that suggested that the Countess was having an affair with the stable boy. Shockingly, both women liked this idea. They called for the stable boy and decided to dress him up to look like the Countess's boy toy. Both Figaro and Susanna left the room to get a fancy cloak for him. While they were out, and to the Countess's great surprise, the Count entered the room. "Sweetie, you'll never guess what I've heard from Bartolo," announced the Count as he jiggled the door handle. Before he stepped into the room, the Countess managed to successfully hide the stable boy in a closet. "What is it, my dear?" she asked in a sweet voice. "Figaro is in debt. He may have to call off the wedding," he said excitedly. The Countess tried to change the subject and get her husband out of the room. Unfortunately, her efforts were spoiled when the stable boy sneezed. "Who's in there?" asked the Count suspiciously. The Countess smiled and answered, "That's just Susanna, dear. She's looking in the back of my closet for my old cloak. You know, the one that I liked when we first met." The stable boy sneezed again. "That sounded like a man's sneeze," growled the Count. Fearing what her husband might do to the poor lad, the Countess jumped in front of the closet and tried to dissuade him from his course of action. "I lost the key," she blurted. "Then let's go look for it," grumbled the Count as he pulled his wife out of the room. After they had left, Susanna entered the room with a cloak. She let the stable boy out of the closet and shooed him out of the room, telling him to keep their plan a secret. She then stepped inside the closet and closed the door. Not a moment later, the Count and Countess re-entered the room with a ring of keys. The Count, by this point, was visibly angry, and the Countess, feeling trapped, felt like she had no choice but to tell the truth. "All right, it's the stable boy. He's in there. Just don't hurt him." The Count pulled out his dagger and shouted, "Come out of there, you ill-bred boy!" Susanna stepped out of the closet, smiling and holding a fine cloak. "Here's that cloak you asked for, ma'am," she said. The Count's face turned from red to white to red again. He demanded an explanation. "It was all a practical joke," explained the Countess. "Well, it wasn't very funny," grumbled the Count as he stormed out of the room. "That was a close call," whispered the Countess to Susanna. Susanna stood there for a few seconds before she said, "Wait, isn't that what we wanted? Our plan was to fool the Count into thinking you were having an affair." The Countess sat down and said, "Yes, but I don't want to lose a perfectly good stable boy in the process." Meanwhile, in the hallway, the Count ran into Figaro. "Your wedding is postponed," cried the Count. Figaro protested, but the Count would not listen. "You are facing a very serious lawsuit," explained the Count. "As the lord of this mansion, I cannot allow one of my servants to marry someone under legal suspicion. You'll just have to wait until after the trial." Figaro was deeply distressed, but he did not give up on his plan. The following day was Figaro's trial. Since this was a civil trial held in a local court, the presiding judge of the case would be the Count himself. The Count should have been gleefully rubbing his hands, but instead he was rubbing his hands with worry. "What does this mean?" he asked himself as he reread the anonymous letter he received that morning. "Is my darling wife cheating on me?" This thought gnawed at him while he put on his court robes. The trial began with an opening statement from the claimant's lawyer, Bartolo. "Your Honor," he began with a gruff cough, "I will show that my client has made a legally binding agreement to loan Figaro a sum of money, and I will also show that this agreement clearly stipulates that, upon failure to repay the loan, Mr. Figaro agrees to become my client's serf for a lifelong term." After Bartolo sat down, it was Figaro's turn to make an opening statement. "I will show," he began, "that no such legally binding agreement was made, and furthermore, that Mrs. Marcellina is a stingy old cow." "Objection!" cried Bartolo. "My client is not stingy." The Count nodded in agreement and told the court reporter to strike the word stingy from the record. Bartolo thanked the judge and sat down next to Marcellina, who glared at him menacingly. The trial went on for some time. Eventually, the subject of Figaro's marriage came up. The Count's mouth curled into a smile as he asked Bartolo to clarify an important matter of nuptial law. "Dr. Bartolo, is it true that a person must have his or her parents' permission to marry?" Bartolo confirmed that this was true. "And Figaro, is it true that you have no parents?" Figaro was forced to admit that this was true. "Then, by the laws of the king, you cannot get married," declared the Count with a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "But, Your Honor," protested Figaro, "if that's true, then no orphan in the whole country can get married. That's not fair to those who, like me, were abandoned on the doorstep of a barber shop." Marcellina turned her head and asked, "You were abandoned at a barber shop?" "Yes," asserted Figaro. 40 years ago, my mother left me on the stoop of the Sweeney Todd discount barber shop on Fleet Street. The only things she left me were a note and a little wooden duck. named Bob Quackenbush. Marcelina's eyes widened. Did your note say, please take care of my ugly duckling until he becomes a swan? Figaro turned to look at Marcelina and said, How did you know? Marcelina ran toward Figaro and gave him a huge hug. My ugly duckling, I have found you! The whole court celebrated the happy reunion of mother and son. Dr. Bartolo, announced Marcelina, I wish to drop all claims. The case is dismissed. The whole courtroom cheered. Now wait just a doggone minute, shouted the Count. I'm the judge, and I say when the case is dismissed. You still owe court fees. No sooner did he say this than Susanna and the Countess entered the courtroom. I will pay the man's court fees, announced the Countess. The Count stood up out of his chair and pointed an accusing finger at his wife. You won't have any money to pay court fees after I'm through divorcing you, he bellowed. The Countess and Susanna laughed. Relax, she hasn't cheated on you. We just wanted you to think that in order to distract you, while we sold your cloak to raise the money. The Count fell back into his chair and was overcome with feelings of relief, shame, and defeat. I'm so sorry, sweetie. I've been a real pig lately. Can you ever forgive me? The Countess walked up to him, kissed him on the cheek, and said, Of course I forgive you, you big dummy. Later that afternoon, it was decided that the village would host a double wedding. Figaro would marry Susanna, and Marcelina would marry Bartolo. The whole village showed up to celebrate the happy couples. Everyone was smiling, even the Count. As the couples rode away in their marriage chariots, the Count turned to his wife and said, You sold my cloak? The questions. Number 1. Who wanted to break up Figaro and Susanna? A. Marcelina. B. Bartolo. C. The Countess. D. The Count. The answer is D. The Count. Question 2. Why did Marcelina sue Figaro? A. He killed her husband. B. He stole her cloak. C. He spread nasty rumors about her. D. He owed her money. The answer is D. He owed her money. Question 3. What secret was revealed during Figaro's trial? A. Marcelina is Figaro's mother. B. Susanna is Figaro's mother. C. The Count is Figaro's father. D. The moon landing was fake. The answer is A. Marcelina is Figaro's mother. Question 4. How did the Countess raise the money to pay for Figaro's court fees? A. She got a second job. B. She borrowed money from Marcelina. C. She robbed a bank. D. She sold a cloak. The answer is D. She sold a cloak.